Here is a number from a blood panel. That number is an emergency, and the reason is the heart. Potassium and calcium set the rhythm of the heart, so by pushing them past their limits, they can also stop it. The problem is that most courses skip the logic behind that and just hand you a table instead, which you memorize for the exam and forget it afterwards. But we are going to do it differently across 4 videos. In the last 2, we're going to take the 4 imbalances apart and get every ECG change out of them. But all of that logic runs through a few ion channels. So in the first 2, we'll explore just them. So just the channels and what makes each one stop and start working. In this video, we'll just focus on the calcium channels. And in the next one, we'll do potassium. So to start, let's look at one idea that every channel here shares. A voltage-gated channel does not simply open and close, but rather it has 3 states. Closed and available, so the channel is shut, but it is ready. Give it the right voltage, and it opens. Next, we have an open state, where ions can move freely. And an inactivated state. The channel is also shut, but now it will not open, even if the voltage is beyond threshold. For an example, let's take sodium channels. The channel opens at around -65, and the inactivation gate shuts it about a millisecond later when it reaches a high enough voltage. And it will not reset until the membrane goes negative again. This pattern is the model, and it naturally raises 2 questions. What inactivates this channel? And what does it need before it can work again? Sodium channels have an easy answer to both. Depolarization inactivates them and repolarization resets them. But calcium and potassium are more interesting, and their answers are where the arrhythmias come from. Let's start with calcium. It comes through the L-type voltage-gated channel. It activates at around -40 millivolts, so it opens later than the sodium channel. And it activates slowly. Where the sodium channel is finished in about a millisecond, this one takes tens of milliseconds before it inactivates. It is still carrying calcium hundreds of milliseconds into the beat, long after every sodium channel has inactivated. And that's great, because that's what makes the plateau possible. But how is it that it can work so slowly? Well, this channel has a hard job. Outside the cell, there's a lot more sodium compared to calcium. Sodium even outnumbers it by more than 100 to 1. And another problem is that sodium is the smaller ion. So a plain calcium-sized hole will not cut it, because it would let far more sodium through than calcium. To solve all of this, we have to have selectivity, which we can achieve with binding. Deep in the pore, there is a ring of 4 glutamates, 4 negatively charged amino acids pointing inwards. The trick is that calcium carries 2 positive charges and sodium carries just 1, so calcium binds to that ring far more tightly. So when sodium turns up and finds the site already taken by a calcium ion, it cannot shift it. So now our channel is selective. But the cost for that is that the channel that holds onto an ion is slow to pass it along. The calcium only moves when a second calcium ion arrives behind it and shoves it off. So the channel is slow because it is picky. The same grip that makes it selective is what stops it working quickly. Which is lucky because the heart needs a current that lasts, and a fast calcium channel could never hold a plateau. Now that we understand that, let's return to the questions. So what inactivates the calcium channel? So there are 2 separate mechanisms, voltage-dependent and calcium-dependent inactivation. First, let's look at voltage-dependent inactivation. So depolarization opens the channel, but it also gradually pushes it towards an inactivated state. The important word here is gradually, because voltage does not instantly switch the channel off. Instead, each voltage sets a new state that the channel population slowly moves toward. That means that voltage-dependent inactivation depends on two things, not one. First, how depolarized the membrane is. This determines how much of the channel population would eventually become inactivated. And second, how long the membrane remains depolarized. This determines how close the channels actually get to that final state. So if you hold the membrane at one voltage for long enough, the channel population eventually settles. The more depolarized the voltage, the greater the fraction that becomes inactivated. That final fraction is called steady-state inactivation, and it is what the textbook inactivation versus voltage curve represents. But the beating heart is almost never at steady state. Rather, its voltage is constantly changing, so the channels are always moving toward the target that is itself moving. And the speed of that response is what we mean by channel kinetics. The important takeaway is that you know that voltage-dependent inactivation isn't just dependent on voltage, but also time. Now let's look at calcium-dependent inactivation, which is surprisingly the more powerful of the two. There is a calcium-sensing protein called calmodulin, and here it is not just floating around waiting to bump into the channel, but rather it is permanently tethered to the channel's own tail, sitting right at the inner mouth of the pore. So when calcium comes through, it is the first thing it meets. Calcium binds to it, it changes shape, and it pulls the channel shut. That is called calcium-dependent inactivation. That arrangement means that the channel is not measuring the calcium level of the cell, but rather it is measuring the calcium coming through, which makes it a feedback loop. More calcium through the channel, more binding to calmodulin causing faster shutdown. So the current switches itself off, and the faster it runs, the sooner it does it. And that loop is what sets the length of the beat. A fast calcium current shuts itself off quickly, giving us a short plateau, and one that goes slowly gives a long one. So anything that changes how much calcium arrives changes how long the heart stays depolarized, and how long the QT interval is. That is what both calcium imbalances do, and we'll take them apart in the next videos. Now that we understand the inactivation, we can move on to the recovery question. So what must happen before an inactivated calcium channel can open again? We know that the channel must recover from two forms of inactivation. First, the membrane must repolarize, since going negative relieves the voltage-dependent inactivation. But same as in inactivation, recovery is not instantaneous. The voltage determines the speed of recovery, and the channel must remain at that voltage for long enough. And second, to release the calcium-dependent inactivation, the local calcium concentration near the channel must fall. Since calmodulin remains tethered to the channel, the calcium bound to it must dissociate before inactivation can be relieved. That local calcium is cleared up by the uptake into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and by the transport out of the cell. But before we finish, I'd like to point out an important detail that matters a lot for arrhythmias. Activation and recovery from inactivation can occur over overlapping voltage ranges. Since repolarization is not instantaneous, the membrane slowly moves downward through a whole range of voltages. Along the way, it can enter a voltage range where some calcium channels begin recovering from inactivation, while the membrane is still depolarized enough to activate the same channels. If the membrane passes quickly through this range, very little of them reactivate. But if repolarization is slow, more channels can reopen and allow calcium back into the cell. This renewed current can produce a second depolarization during the same action potential, which is known as an early after depolarization, and it's one of the mechanisms by which a cardiac cells can trigger premature beats. And if enough cells are affected, it can produce torsades de puentes. But we'll explore that in the later videos. For now, that's all for calcium. And in the next video, we'll explore the potassium side of things.